Pour yourself a glass of milk in New York City, 1858. It pours thin and it pours faintly blue. So the dairyman corrected the color before it ever reached your kitchen using chalk, plaster of Paris, a little flour, a beaten egg, and a spoonful of molasses. You are drinking a construction material. But nobody in that supply chain is committing a crime, because in America, at that moment, there is no law that says they can't. These men are not outlaws. They are the ones with the better margins. The phrase "no food safety laws" sounds like a gap in the statute books, like something nobody had gotten around to filling in yet. It was a working legal doctrine with a name, and the name was buyer beware. Standing in that grocery, you carried the entire burden of inspection. That doctrine functions perfectly well in a village. You know the miller by name, you have seen the cow in the field behind the barn, and the man selling you cheese lives 4 doors down, so cheating you costs him his entire customer list. Now put 800,000 people in Manhattan, buying through 3 layers of middlemen from producers whose faces they will never see, out of unmarked barrels on a wharf. The enforcement mechanism that made buyer beware function has quietly evaporated off the docks. The doctrine stayed on the books anyway, and underneath it ran arithmetic that never stopped. Butterfat costs real money, water costs nothing, chalk costs a few cents a sack. Every ounce of the expensive thing swapped out for the cheap thing lands as pure margin in a Brooklyn counting house. The customer paid for a quart and received a quart. He simply received a quart of something else. None of this was a secret either. A chemist had already published a laboratory proof 38 years before that glass of milk, and it destroyed his life. London, 1820. Frederick Occum, a German-born analytical chemist working out of a laboratory on Compton Street, bought ordinary groceries off ordinary shelves and ran tests on them. Alum in the bread to whiten the loaf, red lead in the cheese, peppercorns manufactured out of linseed meal and clay with a pinch of cayenne rolled into them, sulfuric acid in the vinegar. Beer dosed with Cocculus indicus, a poisonous berry used to stretch the hops. He published the results in a treatise with a skull on the cover, and a line from the Book of Kings underneath it. There is death in the pot. It sold 1,000 copies in the first month, and then Occum made the mistake that mattered. He printed the names of the firms. Within weeks, his reputation was gone. He received threats. A lawsuit arrived, and inside a year he had left England for good, teaching at a technical institute in Berlin until he died there. Britain eventually passed its Adulteration of Food Act in 1860 after arsenic got mixed into a batch of sweets in Bradford and killed 20 people. America would wait another 46 years. The baker kept selling alum loaves and the brewer kept dosing his barrels. Only the chemists with the test tubes lost everything, because information was the single thing in that system capable of threatening a margin, so information was what the trade went after. Meanwhile, in New York, the most profitable version of the trick was already running, and it was running next to a whiskey still. Distilleries in Manhattan and Brooklyn had a garbage problem. Every batch left behind thousands of gallons of spent mash, hot, sour-soaked grain, worthless and expensive to cart away. Then someone parked a cow beside the still. The cow eats the waste, the cow produces milk, and a disposal cost turns into a revenue line on the same balance sheet. Inside the stables, it looked like this. Cows tied in rows in wooden stalls, fed hot mash and nothing else, standing in their own filth, teeth loosening in their jaws, ulcerated sores opening across their bodies and inside their udders, animals too weak to stand held upright with ropes and milked anyway. Historian Richard Meckel found that by the late 1830s, this stuff made up somewhere between 50 and 80% of all the milk consumed in America's large northeastern cities. Not a fringe product on the wagon. The default. In May of 1858, Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper put artists inside those stables and ran the engravings on the front page for weeks. The New York Times followed with an editorial titled "How We Poison Our Children" and carried an estimate that 8,000 infants a year were dying from it in the city. Doctors at the New York Academy of Medicine tied the milk to the infant mortality rate directly. Tammany Hall defended the trade. One of its loudest defenders was handed control of the Board of Health Inquiry. A distillery owner sued Leslie for libel. New York State finally outlawed the sale of adulterated milk in 1862, and the wagons kept rolling because the state never put a meaningful number of inspectors behind the sentence. The obvious explanation for a decade of that is Tammany corruption. The more uncomfortable explanation is arithmetic. So stand behind the counter yourself. You own a clean dairy in 1857, cows on grass in Westchester, cans coming down by wagon, 11 cents a quart to produce. The operation down the block runs on distillery mash and chalk and costs 4 cents. Your customer is standing between the two cans with a tin pail, and there is no label, no brand worth trusting, no test he can run, and no inspector anywhere on that street. So what does he pay? He cannot verify your claim, so he refuses to pay a premium he cannot confirm, and he settles somewhere in the middle. You lose money on every quart out of that pail. The man with the chalk prints it. Economists finally formalized that dairy in 1970 and called it the market for lemons. George Akerlof won a Nobel Prize for the paper. When buyers cannot check quality before they hand over the coins, quality stops being worth producing, and the honest product does not merely lose shelf space. It walks out of the market because staying is financially irrational. That same shape shows up in the window of a candy shop. Walk into an American confectionery in the 1880s. Bright color is still new, and color sells. The standard cheap filler was Terra Alba, pulverized gypsum, sold openly by the barrel to candy makers, and manufacturers quoted prices for adulterated batches and pure batches side by side in the same printed catalog because there was nothing illegal to hide. For some shops, even gypsum ran too expensive, so they cut the sugar with plaster of Paris. Then the color, which is where the candy jar turns. The Cincinnati Enquirer in December of 1882 itemized what that city's confectioners were pouring into the copper pans. Red from vermilion, which is mercury sulfide and from red lead. Yellow from chrome yellow, which is lead chromate. Green from verdigris, and from Scheele's green, which is copper arsenite. An arsenic compound in a glass jar sold by the piece to children. In 1884, the New York City Board of Health seized and destroyed more than 72,000 pounds of adulterated confectionery in a single sweep of the shops. The economics of that counter are almost too clean. Children are the least discriminating buyers in any market that has ever existed. They select on one signal, brightness, and they can detect nothing else. So the shelves gave them exactly what they were selecting for at the lowest possible input cost. And lead chromate is a beautiful yellow. Candy was the amateur end of the business. The professional end sold chemistry wholesale out of a sales brochure. In 1900, the Department of Agriculture cataloged 152 patent preservatives circulating in the American market, branded products with cheerful labels, sold as Mrs. Price's canning compound as preservaline as freezine. A grocer ordered them the way he ordered flour. Strip the branding off the tin and you are mostly looking at borax, salicylic acid, sulfites, and formaldehyde, carried straight across from the undertaking trade, the same fluid going into bodies now going into milk cans. And what those tins sold was not safety. Spoilage on the books is a loss, meat you already paid for and can no longer move. A preservative takes that right off and converts it back into sellable inventory. The Chicago manufacturer Albert Heller advertised freezine on almost exactly those terms. The pitch was that a cut of beef could go out on display, come back to the ice when nobody bought it, take another dose of the product, and still look fine to the next customer leaning over the case. That is not a food additive. That is an inventory turn multiplier. It also carried a body count, and the first big one landed in a city nobody associates with any of this. Indianapolis, 1900. Dairies around the city skipped the branded compound and poured raw formaldehyde straight into milk that had already turned, then sold it at a discount to families who could not afford anything better. 24 infants died in a single orphanage. By Deborah Bloom's account, health officials attributed as many as 400 deaths in the city that year to it. Cincinnati, 1899. More than 1,000 people fell ill from beef treated with freezine, and the city's public health chemist eventually told residents to stop eating beef. He did not mean a particular brand. He meant beef. Omaha told its citizens to stop buying milk from small local dairies altogether because there was no way to tell from the outside of the bottle which ones were dosing. The chemicals went into the discount tier because that is where price is the only thing anyone shops on, while wealthy families across town bought certified milk from named farms at 3 times the money and were fine. Without verification, safety quietly becomes a luxury good. Then the largest customer in America placed an order. 1898 and the Spanish-American War. The War Department shipped roughly 337 tons of refrigerated beef and close to 200,000 pounds of canned roast beef to troops in Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Supplying all of it were the Chicago houses, Armour and Swift and Morris. General Nelson Miles, commanding general of the entire United States Army, testified to the commission investigating the war that the refrigerated beef had been chemically treated and that when it hit a cooking fire it smelled like an embalmed body. He said the canned roast beef was the pulp left over after the juice had been pressed out to make beef extract, packed back into tins and labeled as roast beef. He said he held affidavits from men who had watched the treatment process. Commissary General Charles Egan called him a liar in writing, in language so violent that the Army court-martialed Egan for the statement rather than for the meat. A young cavalry officer named Theodore Roosevelt testified about those rations as well. He told the commission he would rather have eaten his hat. The popular version of this story overshoots, though. Around 280 Americans died from combat causes in that war, and roughly 10 times that number died of disease. The tins took the blame in the newspapers, and the chemical treatment was never actually proven. Typhoid, moving through the latrines of the training camps in Florida and Georgia, did most of the damage. But the scandal handed adulterated food something it had never had. A villain with a name, a contract, and a signature at the bottom of it. But why did Congress sit on its hands for another 8 years? It didn't. The bills were being written the whole time, and the graveyard is enormous. On the 20th of January, 1879, the first bill written specifically to stop food adulteration was introduced in the House of Representatives. Senator Algernon Paddock of Nebraska later got a comprehensive version through the Senate, and it died quietly in a House committee. Between that January morning and the summer the Pure Food Act was finally signed, 190 separate measures on food adulteration were introduced in Congress. 190. 8 of them became law, and almost every one of those 8 dealt with imports or exports rather than with anything sold to an American, often American shelf. The states were not much better. Texas passed a pure food statute in 1885 and never appropriated $1 to enforce it, so the law sat on the books for 20 years as a dead letter while the same barrels came off the same docks in Galveston. Writing a sentence into a statute book is free. Putting a paid inspector on a loading dock in Galveston costs money every year, forever, and inspectors have no trade association. That makes the 8 survivors worth reading closely because every one of them names its own sponsor. The first real federal food law in America was passed in 1886, and it had nothing to do with milk, meat, candy, or preservatives. It was about margarine. The Oleomargarine Act cleared Congress on the 23rd of July, 1886. 2 cents of tax per pound. Annual license fees of $600 for manufacturers, $480 for wholesalers, $48 for retailers. Margarine is animal fat, milk, water, and yellow coloring. Nobody was dying of margarine. It was simply cheap, and it was pulling share off the butter churn. The dairy interests had organized 4 years earlier under a name worth hearing properly, the National Association for the Prevention of Adulteration of Butter, and they went to work on Congress. Several states went further. Vermont in 1884, New Hampshire and South Dakota in 1891, all passed statutes requiring margarine to be dyed pink, not a warning label on the tub, pink dye running through the product itself, so that nobody standing at a counter would ever reach for it. Then, in 1902, Congress raised the tax to 10 cents a pound on colored margarine while cutting it to 1/4 cent on uncolored, and production dropped off a cliff, exactly as intended. If you are wondering how that was a federal priority while Swill milk was legal, so was everyone else. Entry number 2 is where the export books come in. Between 1879 and 1881, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Greece, Denmark, Austria, Hungary, and Turkey all restricted or banned American pork, citing trichinosis. American meat exports fell from $134 million in 1881 to $69 million the following year. Congress moved fast on that one. An inspection law in 1890 covering salted pork and bacon, then a stronger act in March of 1891 covering live animals. The European bans came off. The exports came back, and the meat sold to Americans in American butcher shops stayed exactly as uninspected as it had been the week before. The United States built its first meat inspection system to satisfy a customs officer in Hamburg. The third entry is still sitting on liquor store shelves with a green stamp on the neck. American whiskey in the 1890s was largely fiction. Rectifiers bought cheap, neutral spirit by the barrel, added color and flavoring to imitate age, and sold it as aged whiskey. The additives in the record include prune juice, iodine, and a list of things considerably worse. A distiller who had actually laid oak barrels down for 4 years in a rickhouse was competing against a man who manufactured his product in an afternoon. Colonel Edmund Haynes Taylor, Jr., a Kentucky distiller, pushed Washington for a standard and got one. The Bottled in Bond Act, signed the 3rd of March, 1897. 1 distiller, 1 distillery, 1 season. 4 years minimum in a federally supervised warehouse. Bottled at exactly 100 proof, nothing added but water. The government put its own stamp across the cork as the guarantee. It is frequently called the first federal consumer protection law in American history, and the mechanism underneath the bottle is the giveaway. Bonded warehouses existed so distillers could defer the excise tax until bottling, which meant Treasury agents were already inside those warehouses counting barrels for revenue. Government will reliably certify anything it is already in the room to tax. One entry on that list breaks the pattern, which is exactly why it is worth telling. On the 2nd of October 1901, a retired milk wagon horse named Jim was put down in a St. Louis stable after contracting tetanus. Jim had spent 3 years supplying diphtheria antitoxin, more than 30 quarts of it, drawn from his blood in a city laboratory. Serum collected days before he showed symptoms was bottled and shipped anyway, because nobody tested it. 13 children in St. Louis died of tetanus. 9 more died in Camden, New Jersey the same year from a contaminated batch of smallpox vaccine. Congress passed the Biologics Control Act on the 1st of July 1902 with almost no opposition in either chamber. No opposition because not one company in America was earning a margin on untested horse serum. Nobody had to lose $1 for that law to exist. Set that against milk, against beef, against candy. American food regulation always moved at the speed of the opposition rather than the speed of the dying. Step away from the grocery entirely for a moment because while all of this was happening, a much larger industry was operating with even less friction. In 1905, Collier's Weekly ran an 11-part series by Samuel Hopkins Adams called The Great American Fraud. Adams estimated Americans would spend around $75 million that year on patent medicines. What they were buying, in bulk, out of brown glass bottles, was alcohol, opium, morphine, cocaine, and after 1898, heroin. Soothing syrups sold for teething infants were built on opiates. Cures advertised for the opium habit contained opium. The biggest seller in the country was a bottle called Peruna, sold as a cure for catarrh, a term its own advertising stretched to cover roughly half of all human illness. Adams had it analyzed, 28% alcohol flavored with cubeb and colored with burnt sugar, which put more alcohol in a single bottle than in 5 bottles of beer. Hostetter's stomach bitters ran above 44%. Payne's celery compound, 21, which means a temperance household in a dry county could keep a case of liquor on the pantry shelf, pay no liquor tax on any of it, buy it from a druggist who needed no saloon license, and call the whole arrangement medicine. One physician of the period, Ashbel Grinnell, argued that more alcohol was moving through American patent medicine than through every licensed liquor dealer in the country, ale and beer aside. The Bureau of Indian Affairs worked it out early and barred Peruna from reservation trading posts, reclassifying it as an intoxicant. Peruna, meanwhile, ran an advertisement carrying endorsements from 50 sitting members of Congress. If you want more of the money running underneath the history you were taught, subscribe. That $75 million was never the interesting part of the patent medicine business. The defense mechanism was, and it is the sharpest piece of engineering in this entire story. Frank Chaney, who manufactured Hall's catarrh cure and later ran the industry's trade association, worked out how to make American newspapers fight his legislative battles for him. He printed a clause in red letters on every advertising contract his firm signed. If that state or the federal government passed any law interfering with or restricting the sale of proprietary medicines, the contract became void. Every newspaper in the country running those advertisements now held a direct financial stake in blocking food and drug bills in its own state legislature. The industry never had to buy a single politician. It bought the presses, in advance, at standard advertising rates, and the editorial pages did the lobbying for free. Chaney presented the idea at a trade association meeting and the large firms adopted it immediately. Adams reproduced one of the actual signed contracts in Collier's, from William Allen White's Emporia Gazette in Kansas. To break that, somebody had to make the poison a better story than the advertising was worth. A chemist from Indiana figured out how. Harvey Washington Wiley had run the Department of Agriculture's Chemistry Bureau since 1883, and his laboratory had been publishing findings on adulterated food for years in technical bulletins that almost nobody outside the building ever opened. Evidence was never the missing ingredient. Attention was. In 1902, after years of asking, Congress handed him $5,000 to study what preservatives did to a human being. He called the project the Hygienic Table Trials. 12 young clerks volunteered. Wiley built a kitchen, a dining room, and a laboratory in the basement of the Agriculture Building in Washington and hired a chef. Eat nothing that did not come off that table. Drink nothing but measured water. Weigh in before every meal, record temperature and pulse, hand over every urine and stool sample for analysis. And sign a waiver surrendering the right to sue the government if you were seriously injured. Borax went first into the butter and the milk, doses climbing from 1/5 of a gram toward 4 grams. The men worked out which dishes carried it and quietly started avoiding them, so Wiley moved the doses into gelatin capsules taken mid-meal and had them watched while they swallowed. Headaches came, then stomach pain, then appetite loss severe enough that Wiley recorded the men as unfit for work of any kind. In the summer of 1903, the borax table went on strike and refused to keep taking it in the heat. The formaldehyde trials had to be cut short because the volunteers got too sick. The salicylic acid trials were suspended entirely so the group could recover. A Washington Post reporter named George Rothwell Brown gave them the name that stuck, the Poison Squad. They adopted a motto, that none but the brave could eat the fare, and a vaudeville performer put them in a song. 12 clerks eating capsules in a basement did not produce better chemistry than the bulletins had. They produced a running national serial with recurring characters on the front page next to the patent medicine ads. A chemist can only demonstrate harm, though. Somebody still had to make honesty pay. A few producers had already tried privately. Ladies' Home Journal banned patent medicine advertising in 1892 and simply ate the lost revenue. In Pittsburgh, Henry Heinz built a commercial ketchup that held on the shelf without benzoate of soda, which meant riper tomatoes, more vinegar, more sugar, and a higher cost per bottle. Then he spent more money advertising his own purity. Heinz could tell you his ketchup was clean. So could a man selling ketchup thickened with pumpkin pulp and dyed with coal tar. Both claims cost precisely one printed label, and a claim that is free to make carries no information, so a rational shopper discounts both bottles to zero. That is why Heinz lobbied for the Pure Food Bill. A federal standard was the cheapest available way to make his honesty legible to a stranger, and the firm already paying for quality finally gets to charge for it. And it still was not enough. What finally moved Congress was not a chemist, or a magazine, or a ketchup manufacturer. It was a novel that failed at its own stated purpose. In 1904, a 26-year-old socialist named Upton Sinclair went to Chicago for a small newspaper called Appeal to Reason. He spent 7 weeks inside Packingtown in worn clothes, carrying a workman's dinner pail so nobody would stop him at the gate. He went to write about labor. The Jungle ran as a serial in 1905 and appeared as a book the following year. Readers walked straight past the labor argument and fixated on perhaps a dozen pages describing what went into the meat. Sinclair said afterward that he had aimed at the public's heart and hit its stomach by accident. Roosevelt sent Labor Commissioner Charles Neal and the social worker James Bronson Reynolds to Chicago to check the claims. The packers were tipped off and scrubbed the killing floors before the two men arrived. Their report was damning anyway. Meat shoveled off filthy floors, pushed between rooms and rotting box carts, gathering dirt and splinters, and whatever the tubercular workers on the line spat. Days before the House vote, Representative James Mann stood on the floor holding physical samples. One was a bottle of cherries that had been picked green so they would stay firm, bleached white with acid, afterward dyed back to red with an aniline coloring that was poisonous in any quantity. Then came the number that actually did the work. Domestic meat sales fell hard and foreign purchases of American meat were cut in half. For 50 years, adulteration had been the cheaper option and every incentive in the trade pointed toward it. In the spring of 1906, the reputational cost of adulteration finally climbed above the cost of doing the job properly, and Congress moved inside a month on a question it had buried through 190 previous bills, which is precisely why the meatpackers stopped fighting and started helping to write it. They had lived under federal inspection since 1891, and they knew exactly what it bought them abroad. What that law did not do was cover the small slaughterhouse in Omaha or the county packing plant in Ohio. At the House Agriculture Committee hearings in June of 1906, Thomas Wilson, speaking for the large Chicago houses, told Congress plainly that they had always favored extending inspection and adopting whatever sanitary regulations would ensure the best possible conditions. Ogden Armour published an article in the Saturday Evening Post defending government inspection and insisting the big packers had always wanted it. Tiled walls, drainage, and a resident inspector are a fixed cost. A fixed cost is a rounding error for a plant killing thousands of animals a day and a death sentence for a plant killing 40. Uniform standards are the most effective competitive weapon ever handed to an incumbent, and the men in that hearing room knew it. The argument in that room came down to who would pay for the inspectors, and the Packers won that too. Taxpayers picked up the roughly $3 million annual bill. Senator George Perkins described what the industry received in exchange: a government certificate on their goods. Sinclair himself wrote later that federal meat inspection had been established at the Packers' request and for the Packers' benefit. The man whose book caused it spent the rest of his life pointing out who collected. Roosevelt did apply real pressure. He released an 8-page summary of the Neil Reynolds report and threatened to publish the whole thing if Congress did not move. But he was shoving on a door the Chicago ledgers had already unlocked. Both laws were signed on the 30th of June, 1906. Within 2 years, the man who made them possible had been quietly stripped of his authority. The Pure Food and Drug Act put the burden of proof on the government after the fact. No company had to demonstrate anything was safe before selling it. Wiley's bureau had to prove a substance was harmful afterward, one product and one courtroom at a time, against opponents with better lawyers. The penalty schedule tells you how serious Congress was. A first conviction carried a fine of up to $200. A second carried $300 or a year in jail. In 1908, there was a meeting at the White House about benzoate of soda. A canner in the room mentioned as a point in his own favor that his firm had saved $4,000 the previous year by using saccharin instead of sugar in canned sweet corn. 20 times the maximum fine out of one ingredient in one season. Wiley pointed out that everyone who ate that corn believed they were eating sugar. Roosevelt, who took saccharin every day on his physician's orders, turned on him across the desk and said that anybody who called saccharin injurious to health was an idiot. The following day, Roosevelt created the Remsen Board, a panel of outside scientists, and handed it most of the authority the law had given Wiley's bureau. In 1911, the Supreme Court ruled that the Act's ban on false statements covered only the listed ingredients, not claims about what a medicine could cure. The cancer cures and the consumption cures went straight back onto the shelves, legally. Wiley resigned in 1912 and went to Good Housekeeping, where he built the testing laboratory behind the seal. If the government would not certify quality, a private brand would sell the certification instead. The 1906 law raised the price of getting caught without ever touching the incentive underneath. A requirement that a company prove safety before selling anything did not arrive until 1938, and it took another 107 deaths, most of them children, from a sulfa drug that a manufacturer had dissolved in industrial antifreeze without testing it once. All of which brings you back to that glass of blue milk on a Manhattan table in 1858. Chalk, flour, egg, molasses, plaster of Paris. None of it hidden, none of it illegal, all of it simply cheaper. Every ingredient panel you will read this week exists because somebody eventually made deception cost more than honesty. That is the only argument that has ever worked, so listen for it the next time an industry explains why a rule is unnecessary. Subscribe, and I will keep pulling the ledgers out.